So coming back to our presentation. Now let's talk about user authentication. Now the user authentication is basically, for our case, was designed using two different kind of authentication type. One was domain-based authentication and another was open identity provider based authentication. Now in the first illustration, the domain user, or let's say contours or users, actually had used ADFS V2 for authentication between access control and contours or incorporations. Whereas for users or freelancer users who don't have any Active Directory credentials, the authentication was either performed using Windows Live ID, Google, Facebook or Yahoo. So let's see the whole code or the whole process as an operation. So the objective of the demo would be, how do we configure Azure AppFabric access control for an application? So this is AppFabric on Azure, and for the purpose of the webinar, I created a namespace called IMGroup Cloud Webinar. Let's make it into the access control, and this is my access control screen, and I'll say I'll manage access control. Yeah. So in order to configure an access control, all we have to do is we have to provide identity providers. Identity providers are nothing but kind of an entities or systems which would be creating tokens or claims for security. So in this case, Google or Windows Live ID was added. I can add any other identity provider like ADFS, Yahoo, Facebook, etc., etc. So after adding an identity provider, all we have to do is we have to add a relying party. Relying parties are the application which would be relying on the access or AppFabric's access control for authentication. Let's say sample web app, and say manually, and I will be coming from HTTP say //post/ and let's say after authentication I will go into the same link, will do, and we use Google or Windows Live ID. So after adding application, I can actually add a rule group. Rule groups are nothing but they are individual nodes in the token that is generated by the access control. For example, the application might require a name, an email address, identifier. So this is the place where you can actually add these particular rules. After we have completed a configuration, we would need an application integration link, and since we are using WS Federation metadata, so we'll use this particular link for integrating our web application into access control. We could have used OAuth RAP protocol, which is more open protocol and it's probably used for a lot of other open ID systems. So now let's come into our original sample web application and see how can I add ACS authentication into my simple website. All I have to do is right click and add STS reference. An STS reference, let's say my location would be closed. I'll use an existing which I have just created. Say next, next, finish, and thereby my federation, actually WS Federation, is added into my site. Now if I look into, have a quick look into my web config, I can see all the claims which is required, certificate thumbprint, the links and the URLs into the access control. And with this, my application is almost ready to be integrated with access control, and access control thereafter will provide whole orchestration of user authentication. So let's see how an example of how it actually works. So for the purpose of the demo, I've already hosted a web app, which is, let's say, website, and in code actually it looks very similar to what we had in our sample application. A default ASPX, which is nothing but welcome message with a web config, with certificates and the claim tokens types. So let's see. So the first objective would be, let's see how our web application integrates with Windows Live ID. So now, so here we can see actually our access control is giving us multiple options of, say, Windows Live ID, Google, and domain login. So now if actually we go back and have a look into our access control, so if you look into our identity providers, so we have demo domain, which is a domain authentication, Google, and Windows Live ID. So what we'll do is we'll actually sign in using Windows Live ID. Since I've already signed in, so it might take my current credentials, and here we go. So if you say the same message, welcome, and I am group demo user to my dummy site. Now if you go back into my identity provider and I can look into my access control rule list, and you can see here all my IDs are being passed through from the identity providers into the application. So my application in fact can actually work on any of these claims or any of these values. So now let's see, since now we have seen how an open or independent identity provider Windows Live ID will work. Now let's see the case of actual domain authentication and how does ADFS actually would work in our scenario. So actually here I have a virtual server, or actually having another running on a different domain, and I'll run. The same application, and what we are intended to do here is we will use domain authentication rather than Google authentication or Windows Live ID. So I'll do a domain authentication, use another account, say it's demo user. And I can see the whole URL getting changed, and here we are. So welcome, I am group domain, demo domain, and the user which you entered was a demo user. And this is clearly shows yes, we can do and domain based authentication, and we can as well do Windows Live ID or Google based authentication. So now let's go back into slide and see what exactly has happened in the background. So in the first scenario where we saw a domain authentication, the way it worked was a domain user actually contacted Azure Web. Azure Web then initiated the request for access control because the web application on Azure Web was configured to rely on access control for authentication. Based on the user's chosen option, access control redirected the user into a proper ADFS v2, which was hosted on the demo domain. And based on the AD server, it presented the domain user with a username and password screen. And after performing entering valid credentials and doing authentication, ADFS v2 had sent a response back into access control with all the credentials or claims, which we call in terms of access control. Access control then have sent the same claims back into Azure Web, and Azure Web actually used, let's say, the name item of the claims and displayed as a page containing the message, welcome IMGroup demo user. Similarly, for users who had a Windows Live ID, the user actually went into Azure platform and the access control then redirected the Windows Live ID screen, and the Windows Live ID provider actually presented Windows Live ID general username and password screen, and after authentication the response was sent back to the non-AD user. And we have seen that the look and feel, since they are actually accessing the same application but with different user contexts. So hereby we can actually, access control, we can even manage users with certain roles, and we can actually handle some role privileges and other things. So with this demonstration, we actually saw how easy it is for a web application to be integrated with the multiple identity providers and provide an elegant use of user access management into the application.